Well, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Francesca Heathcote Sapey, who's going to be our speaker today. First of all, I want to thank BNP Paribas Real Estate and our team at ESCP Business School for putting together and sponsoring this great webinar that we have today. The second thing I'm going to do now is to introduce briefly our speaker, and then you will have plenty of time for her lecture and Q&A afterwards. Francesca Heathcote Sapey, in 2018, after 10 years studying and working in London, Francesca relocated to Madrid as partner of Teresa Sapey and Partners, renowned for designing spaces with feelings and developing bespoke projects that provide high-quality experiences. She also works as an external consultant internationally on adult urbanism projects. Recently, Francesca has been named Executive Director of the Master of Science in Real Estate at the ESCP Business School. Following from a degree in architecture and an MA in cultural and critical studies, Francesca obtained the specialized master in urban design and city planning at the Bartlett University College of London. Actively involved in networks such as Young Urbanists and Architects E17, as well as the alumni group at UCL. Currently, Francesca is also a member of the Urban Land Institute of the Spanish Association of Technical Urbanists and of the Spanish Association of Shopping Malls and Retail Parks. Invited guest speaker, lecturer, and published author, her interests include ephemeral architecture and brand identity, marketplaces as socio-economic enablers, as well as meanwhile uses and early site activation, among many others. Thank you very much, Francesco. It's our pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much to Professor Luque for introducing me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, so thank you for joining me. First of all, I'd like to also take this occasion to thank BNP Paribas Real Estate and ESCP for inviting me to take part in this webinar series that we're doing. And as mentioned by Professor Luque, I'll be talking on city models. So welcome, I hope you enjoy it. We'll have a series of poll questions throughout the webinar, which you're not obliged to participate in, but it would be interesting to get your views on. So if you want to get involved, please do. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where you're all very welcome to take part and participate. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I believe you can now see the content. So this webinar is divided into three main parts. The first part looks at city models of the 20th century, some of them, not all of them. And then we'll look at some current proposals that are being studied and developed currently about urban developments and what's going on with cities. And finally, we're going to look at the future, and we're going to look at it in terms of the future is now, it's present. And then at the end of it, we'll have a Q&A. So starting with city models of the only of the 20th century, there's more of them, but we're going to start with the Garden City to see a bit why city models start to appear in history and last century especially, and see what lessons we can learn from them and what's the positives and the negatives aspects of each of them. So actually the Garden City was devised by Sir Ebenezer Howard at the end of actually the 19th century. He was quite an interesting man. He moved to Nebraska actually to try and pursue farming. He didn't like it, and he moved to Chicago in the just after the fire of 1871, the Great Fire. And it's there that he sort of got quite interested and passionate about cities, because he lived part of the regeneration that followed the Great Fire of Chicago. So when he moved back to the UK and he started working in sort of transcribing parliamentary debates, he started to become more and more passionate from a social point of view and the way cities function. And he published a book called Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform that would then lead to the Garden City movement in 1898. To understand a bit the context at the time, cities looked a bit like this. especially in the UK, but not only in the UK. We were living a moment of extreme industrialization of the city, but with no control, no regulation. So industries were booming in cities, but they were also polluting cities enormously. And at the same time, they were attracting a lot of people to come in and a lot of workforce, but the living conditions were very, very bad for the majority of the population, and especially for people working in sort of industrial areas of cities. So this is the context where Ebenezer Howard decides to come up with a solution to this. And we're talking about a moment where pollution is extreme, where there's no nature in cities, or barely any, where there's a lot of diseases and people are clustered together. There's not a very good infrastructure, and diseases sort of start to appear. And well, it's not the first time, of course, but they start to develop and spread quite easily and quite quickly, especially among sort of lower class and low income groups. But not only. There's overcrowding in cities, which at that time is not seen positively due to the lack of a solid hygiene infrastructure, among other reasons, and as mentioned, extreme poverty conditions. There's also terrible housing conditions. People live crammed in small spaces with, for example, no toilets, or toilets are shared communally among different neighborhoods, and so forth. So we have this huge contrast, between the urban world, grey in a way, especially in the London weather, and polluted and poor, and then we have this idyllic, almost utopic view of the countryside, where there's also extreme poverty, but we see it as natural and healthy and welcoming and green and non-polluted. And Sir Howard wants to, his aim is to improve the quality of life of people. So he starts thinking about how a new type of city could work that will improve living conditions, that will improve quality of life, and that will reduce pollution, but also a place where different, let's say, users can coexist in a functional way. And he comes up with sort of, this is the key, which is a garden city. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but he always said that it did, although then it was interpreted literally, that this was a guiding diagram, but then it was used exactly like that, and cities were surrounded by a green belt, and they were extremely zoned. You had residential areas separated from industrial areas, and you had central, very large green spaces, open spaces. But it's been heavily criticized recently, but also during the 20th century, because it actually didn't work as well as it was envisaged or imagined. However, there are many cities that have taken and adopted this model, or that have been developed. His aspiration was to create a social revolution, and sort of in a way even break down capitalism and create a new economic structure through urban reform, which is quite interesting in my view. So what he talks about is about land value capture, and then he also looks at community ownership and in a way community engagement, which is quite rare for that time. So these garden cities are supposed to be green and healthy and idyllic and owned by all the people that live there, and so he wants to make housing affordable in a way for all the workers, healthy and affordable, and he wants to he wants them to be promoting health and well-being and green, and providing several sort of enhancing the natural environment and bringing it into dialogue with the city. So let me see. And he wants people not to have to commute as much as maybe they need to commute, but he wants to provide jobs locally and infrastructure so that they become sort of self-contained garden cities. So this is an example. This is Letchworth Garden City. This was the first one in the UK, and you can sort of see a bit elements of that diagram being reflected in this image. There's also the impact of his thought has then been carried out worldwide. So in Canberra, Australia, when the capital was built in 1913, it was influenced by some of these principles. Hellerau in Germany, that is all very organic and all houses look a bit like cottages. and it was very much planned, and several cultural visionaries before the World Wars inhabited and lived in Hyperlocal. And then we have also Milton Keynes more recently in the UK, so after the World Wars in the 1960s, to help London, because London was growing enormously, to help demographically, they decided to build new satellites, so to speak, cities around the southeast of England. Among them, Milton Keynes is one of the most famous ones because it became a bit of a hub for startups, for innovation, for technology, for businesses back in the day. Today, heavily criticized because it's very much car-based, and also it tried to bring together sort of some principles from garden cities that didn't quite really work. And we also see it even in sort of more recent developments. There's a Globalisation, Valladolid development that also seeks to bring in that dialogue of the garden city principles into 200 hectares. With a density of 61 houses per hectare, which is something that nowadays we don't look for really when we do urban development, but we'll look at that a bit in more detail a bit later. So the things that really didn't quite necessarily work that we thought would work were extreme zoning, so really segregating different uses into different areas. Density, so overcrowding was heavily criticized, and therefore these new garden cities were really low density. They actually later on we discovered density is really important and vital to cities, although again that's in debate at the moment due to the actual circumstances. But we know that density is key for a city to thrive. Density of people, of jobs, of buildings, of activities, of commerces, because they come together, they interact, and they connect with one another. The scale, even if in the drawings the scale doesn't seem maybe that big, it's actually low rise, most of it, but it's extremely broad. All of the open spaces, all of the open areas are extremely wide, extremely broad, and slightly unhuman in a way. One says, you know, green spaces are good, but they need to be human scale green spaces. And the landscape solutions that were devised and that were implemented didn't really work as landscape spaces for enjoyment necessarily always, but they ended up turning into buffers. So they increased that separation and that zoning. The road network, again, very car-based, very wide carriages, and also there was an attempt to create really good rail networks, but those didn't really then happen. So it was all left a bit in the air. And the housing affordability, that idea of creating a place where all the housing was affordable for the workers wasn't really viable. So ultimately, the house value went up, and the ambition of Howard to create a sort of community city where affordability was key didn't really end up working. And this ended up becoming one of the predecessors in a way of what later on we see turning into urban sprawl, especially in the States, but also in some places in Europe. Continuous sprawling of mid and large cities with only residential, basically, units almost. And although there was an attempt to self-contain these spaces, they often ended up turning into commuter cities, or commuter towns. So a lot of people living in Letchworth, Welwyn, or Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes has its own very strong economy, but Letchworth and Welwyn might commute to London to work. So the whole purpose of creating this green city where everything was self-contained and self-functioning didn't quite work because people started to commute for the jobs. But the interesting factors is always, I always think, I'm a strong believer there's good and bad elements. And and I think it was genius by the time it was done. There's a lot to learn as usual. But the key points, the good points, is that it was a reform. It was an ambition to reform through urban design, through urban planning, and to create a better society. And I think in that sense, it's really an avant-garde proposal. And the aim is not to, make a bigger industry or have a bigger town hall, or no, it's a solid improvement of quality of life. Quality of life at the moment is not good enough for human beings. So let's create something better, let's reform the economy and create an improved quality of life through this type of cities. And originally, even if we don't think so, he actually intended for these to be adaptable. And he writes about it and says this is a diagram, and he already talks about adapting this type of proposal to different sites and how this is just a diagram and each site is different, which is really interesting to see that later on. So this is one element. This image, I thought it was important to include this image to finish a bit this initial description of the Garden City, because in 2018, I believe, the RIBA, the Royal British Institute of Architects, launched a competition about reimagining the Garden City, which I find quite interesting and challenging and contemporary somehow. And this is one of the shortlisted proposals by CF Modern Architects in the UK with Urbit. And I think it's quite powerful in a way. It brings together, the rural and the urban somehow. So I thought it was interesting to finish the Garden City chapter with this image. The second city model of the last century, of the 20th century, I'd like to look at is the Modernist City. So let's dig into. So as we know, in architecture, especially Le Corbusier is the pioneer of modernism. He's very well known as an architect, very much as for his buildings, but he was also very interested in the urban and the city. And he actually co-founded the CIAM, which is the, let's say, the International Congress of Modernist Architects in 1928. And he also started to look at different types of city and model cities that could work or couldn't work to respond to his context. Among them, the contemporary city, the radiant city, and the functional city. We're going to stay mostly with the functional city, which because it was sort of devised at the Charter of Athens. So at the fourth Congress of the CIAM, it's quite interesting because due to the wars and everything, they decided to hold it on a boat. So different really emblematic figures of architecture and design at the time went to Marseille, took a boat, and traveled to Athens, and then from Athens back to Marseille. And they held the Congress on the boat, and they were away actually from the urban context. They were away from the wars. They were away from land, and they were talking about what was going on the land, away from all of these distractions. And during this Congress, they came up with the Charter of Athens. But we need to really remember that even if there are some principles that are key and that we really strongly recognize in modernism, there were also discrepancies and different ideas within it. And we'll see that more of that later on. And so in 1933, they created the Charter of Athens, and within it, after many disagreements and agreements, they start to look at the functional city. And the reason why the city needs to be functional is because the context we're in is the context where cities are growing, traffic, congestion, and basically all of this all of a sudden is seen as chaos. And so the modernist and the functional city is a response to this specific context. And so there's chaos, as I was saying. We start to see Fordism and mass production. And after the World Wars, this is translated also to the real estate industry, to the construction industry, where we see we see small construction firms become huge and mass production of housing, basically. So it's very interesting. And there starts to be new infrastructure, but again, it's not necessarily as planned. And there's a lack. There's areas where there's enough infrastructure. There's areas where infrastructure doesn't arrive. We have the wars. Again, the poverty is a constant element, and there's no regulation or planning, and therefore it's all left a bit to its own self. And so we have the existing city. The picture on the left hand side is ours. The existing city, a bit of chaos, people, cars, pollution, beautiful historic buildings, not so beautiful housing in some areas, and then we have the order on the right hand side, and that's one of the drawings that sort of tries to represent what the modernist functional city should look like. Everything should be extremely ordered. You have cars at the bottom, people walking on top. Everything's really ordered. Housing blocks all the same. And that's a response to the chaos that cities are living at that time. So the principles of sort of the functional or modernist city are order. More than anything, it's a need to reorganize and order everything. It's a time where we don't think about form in terms of aesthetics necessarily, but as something that serves function. So it's more minimal, it's linear, it's much more strict and severe. It needs to it needs to do and develop its function properly. It needs to serve that purpose, and it needs to be designed to serve that purpose. In the Charter of Athens, they talk about the four main uses, so to speak, of the city are to live, to work, recreation, and circulation. And there's a lot of large open spaces that aspire to be green and healthy, but actually lack a lot of activity. And we see the birth, well, not the birth, but at least the increment in interest in design of the high-rise block. This is not skyscrapers, it's high-rise blocks. And it's one of the main characters of modernist developments. And again, we see this interest in zoning. There's a place to live, there's a place to work, there's a place to go and have fun. So there's the coexistence of these three elements of four, living, working, recreation, circulation, are not together. They're all separated, zoned, not scattered, and with specific areas designated for each of them. This culminates after the sort of in 1960. So it's really interesting because modernism, the Charter of Athens is 1933, but then we have the wars, and then after the wars, with the reconstruction of many cities and the need for additional housing, the principles of modernism are implemented later on, implemented also in the 50s and the 60s and in the 70s. And one of the sort of culminations of modernism is, in terms of urban planning and design, is Brasilia, which is planned by Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa from scratch, the new capital of Brazil. And this is one of the pictures, but this is the result. And it's thought in terms of high-rise blocks. The problem with high-rise blocks is that they don't really quite have a front or a back, and generally at ground floor level they're raised and have no activity. So it's sometimes you really need active frontages at ground floor level to create vitality in the urban fabric, and this is not the case here. And everything was planned for the car. Of course, cars were being mass-produced. They were becoming affordable. It was becoming, the must-have for families and people. And so the city was designed for the car and not for persons, really. So you find yourself with enormous roads and motorways running through all of the city, enormous parks, as you can see, but it's so enormous that when it loses that human scale, it somehow becomes too big for a human to actually interact or enjoy or use. Of course it's used, but it's very different from a smaller scale park. And it's surrounded by motorways. And of course, all of the political buildings become really emblematic and really iconic. And so this is one example, but then we see the fraction of modernist architecture, especially in planning, in certain elements, the social housing especially, but Le Corbusier devised Plan Voisin in Paris in 1922, but then also in Amsterdam in 1975 with Bijlmer, which is a neighborhood. The ambition is to create these inclusive neighborhoods where all different groups, different social groups will mix together, and they have these amazing outdoor spaces underneath, and there's no shops or jobs to distract you, and you really enjoy living in these spaces. And unfortunately, it doesn't go that way. They become places for higher segregation, higher crime rates, no activity, very distant from the sort of historic authenticity of cities. And also because they all turn into social housing, and they have families coming in and coming out, and so that cohesion for community isn't really there. And we see it in France and Toulouse as well. We see it all over the world, really. But paradoxically, in a way, we also see what happened in London with the Balfour Tower, for example, but it's happened with many brutalist sort of modernist buildings and social housing in recent years, which it becomes privatized. It's been privatized and it's been refurbished, and the flats are going to be sold. So there's all of these elements that come together that are quite interesting. So the problem that we encounter with modernist city is extreme zoning. Things are far away, extremely zoned. There's a decline of that sense of place, that sense of belonging to somewhere, that natural interaction that happens between buildings. The quality is another key element. So the quality in which these are built often doesn't match the quality they were thought to be built in. They were thought in a way and they were developed in a different way. So that also creates a lot of problems. It was intended for the community, but it's not community oriented. It's unhuman in scale, these huge, huge blocks, very tall, very isolating. They start to be mass produced. So with mass production comes a lowering again of that quality. And they're not inclusive. They're meant to be inclusive, but they're not inclusive at all. They don't welcome all sorts of people, backgrounds, jobs, economies. No, and therefore they end up segregating even more from instead the real value of mixing within the city. But on the bright side, it is important to remember that when they start to think about this, they really want to design places that they're thought to have better ventilation, better natural ventilation, better lighting ventilation, better health standards. And again, as we saw in the Garden City, it's a response that wants to reform society in a way and reform the economy and reform the way of thinking. I mean, the intention is good. And another key and interesting element is that it tries to use the technology available at that time, and it tries to implement it in an innovative way. So that's maybe what we can take from it. But these are, these are just two models that from the 20th century. There were many more. From the Congress of the International Congress of Modernist Architects, led by Le Corbusier for a while. There's a group of them especially that don't agree with what they're thinking, what they're planning, what's being done, and so they break off from the group. They're called the Team 10, and they are more interested in how people group with one another. And from there, again, that breaks into two other groups that look at cities and design and architecture and people and society at the time. One is the New Brutalism, which led by Peter Annales and Smithson, especially in Great Britain. And then the Structuralism led by Aldo van Eyck in the Netherlands, but also then expressed into Japan a lot. So what's actually really interesting at this time, well, then we have Aldo Rossi, of course, with the Collective Memory City, with a response to that cold, functional city, and a return to the history and the legacy and the layers of the city. But what's really interesting is that it's a moment in time where cities start to become really a place of interest for all sorts of intellectuals and architects, planners, activists. Later on in the 60s, we also have Jane Jacobs, who highly criticizes, of course, the functional city, and she's in favor of mix of uses, mix of people, density, and looks at the city from the streets, really. But it's the center where the city starts to gain force, and people start to think about it and talk about it and change it and understand it even more. So to summarize this first block, it's context driven. So what's really interesting about these models is that they're all context driven. They're responses to a specific context. They're urban responses. They're not just responses that are linked strongly to the city and the urban fabric. They seek social reform through innovation and through their proposals. They're top down, so that's important to mention. Well, the Garden City maybe is not as top down as the Modernist City, because the Garden City wants to be also an economic reform and sort of break down capitalism and be very, cooperative. But they are thought in plan. They are thought almost in from the top down, and not from the scale of the human being. They're collaborative, although they're not multidisciplinary. So they're collaborative. So from the Garden City, we have the Garden City movement, and the Garden City Association, that then will lead to the Town and Country Planning Association in the UK. All these groups of people that get together to discuss the city and see how they can improve it. So it is definitely collaborative, but it's not multidisciplinary in the sense we intend today. It's not multidisciplinary in the sense of bringing all the different fields and disciplines together. It's very much a movement that comes from the design, architecture industry, so to speak. It's a lot about innovation. It might not seem necessarily innovative to us today, but it definitely comes from a point of view of innovation, of the city, of the environment, to design a new urban world that is better. And technology, the technology of that time. So this is a summary of block 1, and I think what we can take from it as well is the fact that whilst maybe at the beginning of the century they are more about strict city models, that even if they're intended in a strict way, even then they talked about them being adaptable and flexible, but they're more models. It's like, it should be like this. You should have, you know, big blocks, and they should be raised, and there should be nothing happening at the ground floor level, and there should be open spaces. And we start to move from strict models, and we start to see the rise of principles, different principles and approaches of how cities should be. So this is the end of block 1, and with it we are going to launch the poll question, which I'm going to, apologies, I'm going to have to ask the screen presentation to launch the poll. So here is the poll. So I'm launching the poll now, and the question is, in your opinion, which model is more relevant for today's cities? There's no wrong or right answer. It would be just interesting to see your views, hear your thoughts on this, and see what the result is. And apologies for having to show you my green screen. Okay. So I'm going to give it a few more seconds. I can see the numbers changing. It's quite interesting. Let's see, anyone else? Let's give it 10 more seconds. I'm going to share the results with you because I think it's quite interesting. So I'm going to close the poll now. If you've all answered, it looks like those of you who wanted to participate have. I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results. So the Garden City wins with a 41%. That's quite interesting, exciting. And the Collective Memory City is the last one. Okay, fair enough. Okay, great. Thanks for participating. That was fun. I'm going to hide the results now, and I'm going to launch my presentation. So the second chapter, the second block, is very much about current proposals and current, let's say, city models and trends that we're starting to see. And in the circumstances we currently are, it's been a moment that had allowed us to think beyond and think more about cities. So let's carry on. We're going to look at there's a lot of them. Unfortunately, I can't cover them all here and now, but we're going to look at 3 of them that are quite interesting. So current proposals. So the smart city. The smart city is, by smart city we intend a city that is very, very technological and that uses technology and data to make it more efficient, connect it better, and improve it. In summary, we don't have 100% smart cities, but we have smart city strategies that are being implemented in different cities across the world. And according, I believe, to Forbes last year, London is one of the smartest cities. So they rely a lot on the Internet of Things, and they are very much about ICT, information and communication technologies, and they rely on data analysis, which relies on data being shared, which can be an issue. And they do all of this to improve efficiency and quality within the urban setting. So they're very much about connectivity, they're very much about open data, and they're very much about security, because of course when you're sharing data and when you're asking everybody to share data, people, enterprises, the government, to make it to make everything more efficient, then you really need to have really good cybersecurity, actually. So this is sort of the summary a bit of the smart city. It's hyper connected, not just connected, hyper connected. Everything relies on technology in a way. Everything has to be connected. To know if that parking spot is free, I need to know who was there first, what time he was there, he or she, what type of car was parked there, how big the space is, and so forth. It's hyper integrated, and it's not, it's not just one person. It's all the businesses, all the people, all the vehicles, everything needs to be integrated so that it actually works efficiently and it achieves that goal of being hyper-connected. So you need to get all the agents involved, which is maybe the complicated thing, the most complicated thing about it. And it's technological. It relies heavily on technology and on electricity, of course, or power, some sort of power. So if you lose that power, it's sort of, you need a off-the-grid backup. One of the examples is the link New York City. It's sort of these advertising boards that you see around New York, where you can actually, you have free Wi-Fi, free charging for your phone, free interactive maps. And this is, so when we look at these type of proposals, we need to understand them as different types of intervention that will come into the landscape, into the urban landscape, and help improve it and change it. This was done in New York, but there's many others. It's just one example. But I invite you all to look at the website. They have an amazing like map of it, and they've got a lot of them. And the way it pays for itself is because they use them a bit like billboards to advertise. So advertising pays for it basically, and it's used by all of the citizens. Another really interesting proposal recently developed is, this is really recent, is the Woven City for Toyota. So Toyota's sort of rethinking of its own company and making a shift from, let's say, a car manufacturer to a mobile, automobile movement company. And so they've partnered with a big Bjarke Engel group to design a city that is an incubator for mobility and transport. So I'm going to start by showing you a video that they've prepared, and then we'll carry on. I'll probably speak a bit over the video. And they've thought of 3 types of mobility. So they start from mobility of vehicle mobility. Of course, it will be automated vehicles. And mixed mobility, but softer, so bicycles, skates, and then just pedestrian-only mobility. And that becomes the main grid to create this new type of city with different types of blocks, 2 main squares. And this is the project that Toyota's launching at the bottom of Mount Fuji in Japan. 360 degrees sustainability, as I say. They want to, it's 175, they want to start off with 2,000 inhabitants. Most of them, Toyota employees, but then they'll see, and it's meant to be not necessarily the city of the future, but more of an incubator for thinking about mobility, innovation, technology, within the urban setting, and sort of a lab in a way, is an urban laboratory where they can test and think and prototype and test in real life, really, rather than speculatively, so to speak. So this is their proposal. So it's, as I was saying, an urban prototype incubator. It's trying to anticipate the future. It's about interconnectivity, and it's about sustainability, of course. So sustainable materials, sustainable housing, sustainable materials, spaces, housing, economies, jobs. Of course, the people living there will work there in the incubator. And it's very interesting, this idea of creating a live incubator, basically. It's based, of course, they start analyses by looking at mobility and devising these 3 types of lanes. Then they multiply by 3 and they distort, and they try and preserve the local identity of Japan, of Toyota as a brand, through the materials used, the space of design, and the architecture. So as I was saying, it's at the bottom of Mount Fuji. It's not built yet, but the plan is to build it at the bottom of Mount Fuji in Japan. They'll start off with a pilot of 2,000 people and then take it from there. It's done by Toyota with Bjarke Engels, and it's very much focused on sustainability and research. And this is what they want it to look like, or what it will look like. And here's a bit of an explanation. All of this is how big they're going to explain it. There are 3 types of lanes. The first one, as we were saying, you can see it there in blue for vehicles, in this case automated, of course. The pink one is more for mixed types of, let's call them softer vehicles, like skating and cycling, and pedestrian only. And so that creates this grid that you can see quite clearly on the screen. And they weave into the blocks, and then they multiply it, and that in turn they open up a central green space, open space in a central park, and this is what they expect for it to look like. Very natural and very sustainable. And finally, the third current proposal I'd like to discuss with you, which has been in the press very much these days, is the 15-minute city. So the 15-minute city, which Paris wants to implement, is a city where you can move, live, work, and have all of your services within a 15-minute walking or cycling radius from your house. So the house is in the middle, as you can see on the screen, and everywhere, you can get everywhere, you can get all of the services, your doctors, the schools, jobs, everything within 15 minutes of a sustainable transport mode. Of course, this is complicated in the sense that it requires a lot of different strategies to be implemented. It won't happen overnight. But they talk about, the important elements are dwelling in dignity, working in proper conditions, being able to gain provisions easily, well-being, education, and leisure. And they want to bring all of this together in this 15-minute radius, which is very, very interesting. And it's somehow, there's something about the garden city that echoes a bit. But in order to do so, they need to deconstruct the current way the city operates, and they need to allow for users to mix much more. And they need to also be able to attract different layers of society and different groups, to avoid what happened in other models, for example, to avoid segregation, and so that the solutions are inclusive for everyone. And also, some people might not actually want to cycle or walk, so that's also a right. But they'll need to deconstruct certain schemes. They'll need to enable a lot of mixing, and they will everything will be within hyper proximity. Everything needs to be really close, and in each neighborhood or 15-minute neighborhood, that needs to all happen. So it's sort of a process. This is an image of how they envisage it a bit, where you have a lot of outdoor spaces, a lot of life happening between buildings, a lot of life happening outdoors, shops, activities, sports, classes, all sorts of things. So this is very recent. It's actually very much in the process at the moment. So it's quite an interesting approach. But what we really need to remember also is that all of these approaches need to think about all the groups within society, and a lot about the value of housing. If I live centrally in a very expensive apartment, very small and expensive apartment, and I work outside the city, I need to be able to get there. Or maybe it's the other way around. I work centrally because it's where most of the jobs with my skill set are available, for example. But due to the high rent of central housing, I have to live very far away, and therefore it's not a 15-minute commute. So there's a lot of things, but they're thinking about all of this, and it's quite an interesting approach. So what's really interesting about the 3 of these schemes is that the 3 of them start with mobility. The smart city is about mobility through connectivity. The woven city is very much about looking at different types of new types of mobility and devising cities that way. And this last one is about mobility within a 15-minute radius. So I find that very powerful and interesting. There's sustainability is at the core of all of these schemes, proposals and elements. Access to services is really important. You need to be able to access services really quickly. You need to be able to get to hospital really quickly. The quality of the environment, of the space, of the activities that are done in that environment, same. They need to be versatile. They need to be versatile developments that can adapt, can grow, can change, and can adapt themselves to different circumstances. They all look at spaces and uses, there's new types of spaces and uses coming and showing up. The importance of health and well-being, which is not new, and the role of technology in all of this. And so the second block, in my view, is very, very much about new connectivities. It's very much about creating new types of connections within the urban fabric at different scales between different elements, but it's very much focused on connectivity. So this is the second block, and now we're going to enter our last block. But before we enter the last block, there's one more poll. The second block poll, which I'm going to launch now. And let's see, you're not obliged to participate, but I'll give you a minute or so to answer. And let's see. So the poll question is, which is your preferred proposal from the three? There's many more, but from these three proposals, which one is the one you're most, the preferred one? So I'm going to launch the poll. And I'm going to give you all a few seconds to answer. And then we'll carry on with the last block. So I'm going to try and do in the next 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, which we'll see what debates are available. So, I'm going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, so I'm going to share the results with you. I'm going to close the poll. I'm going to share the results. So it's the 15-minute city. I was expecting that one. That's a preferred choice. Great. So I'd encourage you all to, if you're very interested in knowing more about it, to research it, because there's some really interesting things coming out of that. So I'm going to hide the results now, and we're going to carry on with the last block. So the last block is called The Future is Now, and it's called The Future is Now because within real estate, especially, and within urbanism, we think very much long scale, long term. We plan and think and design for when we might not even be here, or due to different circumstances, the projects take forever to be carried out, to come into place and to happen. And whilst I think it's really important to keep an eye on the future, and it's really important that what we develop today is resilient and adaptable and versatile and flexible and will respond to future needs. The future is now. We need to address issues that are happening now in the urban scape, and we need to respond to, we need to provide solutions within the urban fabric that respond to issues now. This doesn't mean we all of a sudden have to do everything for now, and then tomorrow whoever's there is left to sort it out. No, it has to have that long-term view, but it needs to be injected now. So I'm going to talk to you about some principles that I think are relevant on shaping the city of tomorrow, which is actually the city, it's supposed to be a city of today. And I'm also saying this because recently there's been a lot of talk about, with all the current situation in COVID, there's been a lot of talk about healthy modes of transport, as if there were something new. And sadly, it's taken a crisis like this to show us that that was the right way to go a long time ago. And we've been talking about healthy modes of transport for many years now. And there's always an excuse not to implement a full healthy mode of transport strategy citywide. And so I think we must not lose, the momentum. The second thing is that due to the current climate, despite the sad circumstances, it's also allowing us to speculate in the good sense of the word. And I think it's a great moment to be speculating about the urban scape and testing it. And it's an opportunity to implement things and make them happen, actually, because we need to make them happen. So I'm going to carry on now. So the future is now. So as I was saying, speedier and more flexible in everything. We need the real estate process to be speedier and more flexible. That doesn't mean it needs to be lower quality. It just needs to be smoother. It depends a lot on the legal framework of different countries, but generally there's some recurrent elements that can happen in a quicker way. and that can enable and support and improve the current economy. So, well, bureaucracy, of course, all the paperwork, the bureaucracy, the licenses, it depends on the country you are working and operating in, but generally it's a very lengthy process. It's a process where you might have a land and it might take you 5 years before you can actually start making a profit out of that land, 5 or even 10 or even 15. So we need that to be faster. And all of these principles I'm going to talk about right now, about the future is now, they are principles that I think were extremely valid before COVID, and I think they keep on being valid, or maybe they might be in some cases even more valid due to COVID. So one is this: speedier and more flexible processes, speedier and more flexible and more sustainable construction development, and likewise speedier and more flexible types of projects and types. This is a space in London. I really like this project, but basically it has a meanwhile use in it, and this is a type of use where they give them a license initially for 2 years, and the local authority, it's a local authority building, and they've transformed it into an affordable co-working for the local community, and they've welcomed a bakery to whom they lease part of the space, and then they have all of these pop-ups activities around it, where different local businesses can come in at different times and have a space to kick off or kickstart their business. So they're flexible also in terms of types of spaces and uses and projects. So in terms of process, as I was saying, in terms of types of developments, scale of developments, and types of projects, in terms of teams. For me, it's really important that the more we move forward, the more multidisciplinary the teams are. The future is now, the second pillar of the future now, in my view, is new times call for new uses. There might be uses that we don't even have a word for yet. And by new uses, I mean mixing different types of uses and coming up with innovative entrepreneurship opportunities within the real estate industry. So not developing housing just because housing will make a profit, but thinking even outside the box. Of course, to do this type of thing, you need to be supported by, by all the legal framework and the government as well. But it's a really interesting moment, I think, to start coming up with different ideas of different types of developments that we might not have yet, and to provide new types and new mixes of uses within the urban fabric that will boost the economy, that will innovate, that will help the economy, that will support society, and that will be sustainable. And so this is an example of this is in East London, and it's a container, sort of a small container village, so to speak, that with different units that you can change the businesses inside each of them. There's this, always in London. I lived in London for 10 years, so many of my examples are often in London, but not always. This is in Hackney Wick, which is East London again. It's an industrial area of London. Used to be very heavy on industry, and then they took over the industries and turned them into breweries and shops, and they become almost their own small city of entertainment. Okay. But these are just some examples. The meanwhile use I told you about earlier is also an example of a sort of new type of use within the urban fabric, especially even before COVID, as I was saying. But now with COVID, there's going to be a change within the urban fabric at ground floor level. Well, not only at ground floor level, but sadly, we're going to see a lot of probably restoration and retail close, very likely so. And we are going to have to think outside the box about what uses can make a profit at this time in those spaces. And maybe it's a use we don't know yet. Maybe we don't even know what the activity is. Maybe there's no word to name it yet. But the visionary who can solve that can probably come out of it strong in a way. And the same will have to do with office spaces. It's very likely, I can't predict the future, but we can speculate, as I was saying earlier. It's very likely that office spaces, big companies even, and smaller companies are going to reduce their office space, and therefore there's going to be a lot of office space available, but not for office use, because that will no longer be in demand. And you can transform some of it into residential, but not all of it. So what else can we put in there that can be useful, beneficial, interesting, make money hopefully, and so forth? So there's a lot to think about in terms of uses in space. So I think it's a lot about thinking outside the box. The city of the future that is now is a lot about thinking outside the box. It's a lot about thinking about new business opportunities. And it's a lot about innovation, and it's a lot about mixing uses. The third point is the globalization of the hyperlocal. We see this return towards the local, towards the neighborhood, towards local economies, local businesses, local identity, and we see this in the 15-minute city very well. And it's interesting. I decided to call this the globalization of the hyperlocal because on one side it's about really getting into it at a local scale, at a neighborhood scale, at a community scale, but at the same time, it's not something that we're seeing locally. It's something that we're seeing happening globally in most Western cities, actually. And there's all sorts of scales, you know, from bakeries, sourdough bakeries, to all sorts of, you know, social groups and organizations. But this is one of many examples, the superblocks in Barcelona, which takes, you can see on the left-hand side the current model where there's the grid, on the right-hand side the implementation of a superblock where it's basically a square of roughly 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. You have the main vehicular roads all around it, and then in the middle where you see the green, they become 10 kilometers per hour lanes where pedestrians and cyclists have priority. And so there's an appropriation from society and from the people of those spaces that then become redesigned and reactivated in a very different way. This is a picture. This is an image of one of the interventions that have been done in one of at the entrance of one of the superblocks. So that's another, for example, case study that we can look at in terms of hyperlocal. So it's about boosting local economies. It's about inclusivity and diversity. But again, we need to remember that all of these trends that we're looking at, all of these proposals are very much about city centers or sort of the main body of the city. We need to also be reminded and be aware about everything that is going on around the city, which is still part of the city. And we must not forget, you know, that all these proposals need to be quite inclusive to function properly, because otherwise they risk becoming again segregated. We see a revalue of the life between buildings, of enjoying the street, of enjoying your neighborhood. And finally, the return and rebirth of the neighborhood and the community, you know, spending more time within a limited radius, and revaluing sort of the time, the value of our time to move around, to reach places, to enjoy, to do things. Another element that I think is more and more important is that we tend to see within the industry, I don't like generalizing though, so not everyone probably, but there's often this huge debate between rural and urban. And it's not rural versus urban, it's rural and urban. And there's a lot of value, I think, there undiscovered. And there's contrasts between the built city, the huge beast in a way, that pollutes and consumes and so forth, versus the idyllic but dull at times rural environment. And it's not like that at all. I think it's a really, really interesting moment to actually bring them together, connect them, and help them. As it's about connecting, it's about integrating, it's about cooperating between urban and rural and finding opportunities there. Sorry, I think we are running out of time, so I'm going to speed this up a bit. Finally, the future is now. Sustainability, of course. This is an example of a sustainable project that is being launched in Copenhagen at the moment, where people can, well, it's a sort of park, floating park, and they've recently launched it, which is social and in a way economic, and in a way is also environmentally friendly. And then we also have the city sidewalk labs, the sidewalks lab development. This is a sister company of Google, and they're doing this huge sustainable development in Toronto, in Canada, where they want to create 44,000 new jobs, reduce almost, I think, by 90% their carbon footprint. And it's all very, very much sustainable. I invite you all to have a look at it because it's incredible. So we must really not forget about sustainability. Sustainability can no longer be something that, oh, I have to do it. Oh, I have to get that certification. No, sustainable, it doesn't even have to be a word anymore. It has to be just embedded. And you can't be obliged by a certification to be sustainable, because it's the future in terms of society, economy, and environment. It's added value long-term, both for the developer, for the user, and for everyone involved. And finally, technology as an ally. We really need to start seeing technology as an ally. There's a fear of technology because you can hack it, because if you run out of power, what happens, and so forth. Yes, we need to find solutions where technology is integrated to improve quality of life. I'm reading this really interesting book called The Smart Enough City, which talks about the smart city, but in a way where you use technology not to control everything, but to improve everything. And therefore, we talk more and more about connecting through technology rather than controlling, and we look at automated solutions where they actually prove to be beneficial, and about an increase in safety, security, and sustainability through the use of technology. And finally, for me, the most important message I want to leave you with is this no city model for the future, because no city is the same, and every proposal and every strategy is very much context driven. And this is just one image where you can see different cities, and these are diagrams of density in each city based on the geography and the footprint of the city. But cities are completely different from each other, and they call for bespoke solutions. You might have a set of principles. They all need to be sustainable. They all need to do, promote cycling and walking, but no city is the same. So they all need to promote walking and cycling, but that approach might be different depending on the city is implemented in and the needs of that specific city. So it's very much about, as we were saying, speed and flexibility, about bespoke projects, about sustainability in every aspect, about versatile solutions that are for the present but adaptable into the future, about creating, inventing, imagining, and speculating about new uses, about the hyperlocal, about technology as a friend, and about solutions that bring together urban and rural rather than further apart. So for me, and this is a message I want to leave you with, this is that despite the circumstances we're living, it's an opportunity in a way to think differently, to implement solutions in a faster way, and to change slightly or drastically the way we live and make it better and make it more interesting and make it more profitable for everyone. So thank you all very much for listening. I'm going to launch the last one. I'm going to open questions. So I'm going to launch the last poll, which is about this last blog, which is about which trend you think is most relevant. And there's a series of options there: speeding and opening up licenses, globalization of hyperlocalism, technology as an ally. And wow, the answers are very homogeneous. I can see everything moving in front of me, so it's quite interesting. I'll share it shortly with you, and then we'll do the Q&A. And sorry, I was meant to be a bit shorter, but I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so I'll give it, I can see it, you're still answering, so I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. Okay, 5 more seconds. Anyone wants to answer? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share. So the winner is strengthening the relation between urban and rural. That's really interesting. So whoever voted for that, I'd like to hear what ideas you have in mind. So please share them through the Q&A tool. Okay, so I wanted to thank you all very much for joining me today. I know I talked way more than I have to. I hope you find it interesting. Of course, these are just some principles, and there's a lot out there yet to be done. Now it's the time for Q&A. You have my email there if you want to get in touch. I'd be delighted to hear from any of you. I'm going to pass on the word to Claudia Russo Sanfambenito, who's going to lead the Q&A session. And I hope as many as you join, we'll have a Q&A for the next 10 minutes. And I hope we manage to answer everyone's questions. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Francesca, for also the detailed masterclass, which you kept saying you were limiting yourself, but it was full of detail. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm an ESCP alumni, actually, and I set up the Real Estate Association while I was at ESCP, and Francesca was actually one of our guest speakers, one of the first. So it's great to still have her on board and actually have her launch the Master in Real Estate so that we can keep learning from her knowledge. Firstly, I would like to welcome you all to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. I think it's interesting for us to also learn where you come from. This is a very specific webinar, so it's interesting to see whether, for example, you're an architect and you were naturally drawn to the concept of cities and how they're designed and the models which exist, or whether you're perhaps a debt restructuring in a bank linked to real estate and you wanted to learn what else there is in real estate. So if you want to get in touch, please do, because it's also very interesting for us. And on a second hand, open the Q&A. I will ask the first question just so that you have time to think about any questions and write them down. But Francesca, you mentioned a lot speculation, which really usually seen as a negative term, but it's true that stereotypically you need to do things differently so that something changes, and change is good. So you mentioned a lot of speculation. I don't know if you have any example of something speculative which you did in your professional career, or something that perhaps you see very evident and that no one is approaching.
Thank you for your question, Claudia. So when I talk about speculative in a positive way, I mean that we have the chance to really think outside the box, because things have slowed down slightly, and we need to change some things to keep on going the way we were going, so, or even in a different way. So there's opportunity to think about things differently, and possibly in some cases to even implement these. So I'm thinking, for example, and that's not even that speculative because it's being done, but meanwhile users, which I was talking about earlier, a really interesting use, and not available in every country, not the same process in every country. I talk more about London just because it's where I've had most of my experience, but the fact that you have an empty building at one point, it's no good generally. And if that building is compliant in terms of health and safety and everything, with very little you can transform it. So with a very small investment, you can transform that space. For example, the project I showed you earlier of Central Parade in London, which was done by Scott Architects, it got transformed. The bare bones of the building are there, but with a few desks and a bit of design, and it got transformed completely. They did an excellent project. I'm a very big fan of Scott Architects, and it's run basically by Meanwhile, a company called Meanwhile Users. That's an investment in the public sector, so that's owned by the public sector, and it makes a profit into the public sector. And it's for the people. It's sort of for the people. So in a way, I think Meanwhile Users in some places, including Madrid to an extent, can be speculative in a good way. I mean, it's about thinking about how many spaces are available, publicly owned possibly, that could make a profit even for the local authority with a very small investment, because then you give them to someone else you give the bakery to someone, you give that. So but this is, you know, this is already being done in a lot of countries, but it's the opportunity of not doing things that need to last forever, but doing things that are much more temporary. Meanwhile Users generally at 2 years. I'm not talking a 1 month pop-up. It's a 2 years investment. You do the numbers. Okay, it's going to cost me this much to, you know, put a Wi-Fi and 4 lamps and 4 chairs, and then I'm going to lease these spaces at this price every month, and it's an affordable, basically, co-working space. That's one idea, but that's one example that I think could be replicated, and it's something I'm extremely interested in, because I think it makes economy more dynamic in some cases, and it helps boost local economy a lot. So I'm a big fan of Meanwhile Users, and although it's not fully speculative, it's slightly speculative. In terms of what we are seeing right now, if I had the vision, I'm afraid I wouldn't be sharing it. But I think there's room to think outside the box, to think about what spaces we might need that can survive through not only COVID, but any future pandemic that I hope we'll never have to live again, but we don't know. And sort of thinking about, all those office spaces that might no longer be needed. What can we do with them that goes beyond residential? Do we put, disco with huge separations, plastic separations where you dance in tubes? I don't know. I don't think that's a solution, but it's thinking way beyond, restoration, hospitality, residential, office space. It's thinking about an integration of different uses that keeps on making cities thrive and connect, but allows for them to be profitable in economic terms, despite any type of circumstance you might encounter.
Yeah, and also being able to accept them, right? I mean, if they don't fit into the regulation, you might be limited to not being able to do something, such as senior co-living, for example. Where do you put that? Is that residential? So there's a lot of gray areas, but definitely mentally it needs to be incorporated in how a city functions so that they can accept different uses. And that will take a while, but I think that perhaps this COVID period has made us more prone to adapt and to change, because we've seen that we are more resilient than we thought. So let me just ask you a couple of questions that they're sending through.
Yes.
We've seen that social housing projects were linked to higher criminality rates, etc. What do you think could be an alternative use to social housing in order to put an end to slums in developing countries, for example?
Well, that's a really complicated question. It's a lot of things. So there's a big difference between social housing and slums. Let's start by that. There is social housing, I don't like generalizing again, but social housing in the Western world is still housing. It's generally, some may be worse, some may be better, but it's still a much better condition than a slum. Slums are, actually technically they're called informal settlements. We can't even enter in that conversation because you can't compare social housing to a slum. You can't really end slums. So the way you sort of go about informal settlements or slums, or that's what the trend is at the moment and what is seen to work best, is not to end them or eliminate them or move people from slums, but if the land they're occupying is safe enough, so there's no risk of really bad earthquakes or stuff like that, then what you do is you work with the slum to upgrade it. So it's called upgrade of informal settlements. And it's a really complicated process because generally the land where they're based is not, it's not public, and it's generally, well, it's either public or private, but it's not theirs. They've just occupied it. So the first step is to understand who owns all of that land and try and purchase it off or get some agreements so that the people who have occupied it can stay on it. That's the first step. Second step is infrastructure, getting really good infrastructure in terms of piping, water, electricity, and so forth. And then slowly you help upgrade the living conditions for the people who are living there, but that's their home, so you can't just end them. Like the thing that has proved to work the best is this sort of bottom-up approach where you go step by step, unless of course there's a huge risk of earthquake or a volcano nearby that can explode or go off anywhere, and then that's the case where you would have to move them. But you wouldn't just build social housing and tell them to move in it. Like that's now not longer the best, the solution best considered. Improving social housing. So not all social housing was designed by the modernists. A lot of it was, but not all of it. There's a lot of ways to improve it nowadays. And actually the tendency we see is no longer to, divide society into, social housing, affordable housing, and high-end housing. But it's more about trying to mix. And it's really hard sometimes, but the trend is to mix as much as possible. It's not always easy, but that's the current trend. So I hope that answered the question, Youssef. I hope that was helpful somehow. Any other questions?
There's actually a few, but we can see who wrote them, so perhaps we can reply privately to those who did. I just want to ask one last question, which is something that you mentioned before. a question by Juan Cortes, and the project which you mentioned about the sidewalk labs, which is something unique. I think it was about a week ago or 10 days ago. Lost track of time with COVID. It's actually been stopped. So this is going to have obviously a huge impact. So the question here is, how critical do you think that it will be in terms of the high-tech smart cities narrative?
I don't think, I wouldn't say it's a critical blow-off to the high-tech smart cities narrative, but I think smart cities, what I was saying earlier, you can't just develop a model called smart cities and say, okay, now the world has to share all of its data, all enterprises need to be hyper-connected, and technology is going to solve it. It's about taking the best of each. So it's not a blow-off to high-tech. High-tech is here. I mean, if we didn't have computers, probably the little economy left during the quarantine wouldn't have even been able to operate. So technology is our friend, ultimately, in a way, despite, you know, some things that we don't want to. I'm not going to get into the whole technology, non-technology, but I don't think it's a blow-off. I just think we need to start thinking about cities in more bespoke terms, and we need to provide more bespoke solutions for cities. And smart cities won't work for all, but technology will help all cities. I'm sure there's a technological solution that can be implemented in every city in the world that will improve it. I can't tell you without having done a previous study which solution in which city, but you know, in London, when you go through the tube turnaround, you touch it. Now with all this hygiene reasons, you can automatize that, for example. But that's one of the many things. Some things might be beneficial in a city, and another one no, because they are used to doing things a different way, or they don't see the value in doing that. So I think it's not a blow off. I just think we need to create bespoke frameworks rather than models, and bespoke solutions for cities based on the principles that the world's moving towards. I hope that helps.
We have a few more questions, but we've kind of filled up very usefully all our time. So we'll get back to those people who asked the questions privately, if you like. And thank you, Francesca, again for your time, for your insights, which are of an expert. So they're evidently very useful to people who do other kind of work, and people who do your kind of work, that they can be challenged with different thoughts. So thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining me, and you have my email address, so get in touch. I'd be delighted to hear from you.